The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Elvira Turner decided she had waited long enough for a miracle and climbed up onto her own roof to become one. It was the autumn of 1878, deep in the hill country of central Texas, where the live oaks grew thick along the creek beds, and the red clay roads turned to rivers of rust when the sky opened up. The town of Harlan's Crossing sat at the intersection of two such roads, a modest settlement of perhaps 300 souls who made their lives from cattle, corn, and the quiet stubbornness that the frontier demanded of everyone who chose to stay. Elvira had not chosen this life exactly, not in the way that a woman with options might choose a hat from a milliner's window, but she had accepted it with both hands, and she had come to love it the way you love a thing that has cost you something real. She had come to Harlan's Crossing 7 years ago as the young bride of George Turner, a decent man who had dreams about cattle and land and building something worth leaving behind. George had built the house himself, 2 rooms wide and solid enough, with a front porch that faced west so you could watch the sunsets from the rocker he had carved during the winter of their first year. He had been good with his hands and good with a laugh, and Elvira had loved him honestly, if not with the kind of fire that poets wrote about. She had been 22 when they married, and George had been 29, and they had settled into one another the way two people do when they are both practical and kind, and trying to make something grow in hard soil. George Turner had died 18 months ago, thrown from a horse during a sudden thunderstorm on the road back from Abilene, where he had gone to sell cattle. The horse had spooked at lightning, and George had come down wrong on the rocky ground beside the road, and by the time 2 passing cowboys found him, the rain had already washed the tracks away, and there was nothing left to understand except the fact of it. He had been 36 years old, and his boots were still good, and Elvira had stood at his grave with her hands folded, and felt the world reorganize itself around a new and permanent absence. She had a daughter, Clara, who was 4 years old and had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. She had a small herd of cattle, 12 head, that she had managed to keep through the first winter after George died with the help of their neighbor, old Hector Danning, who was 68 and arthritic, but still sharp enough to tell her what to do even when he could not do it himself. She had the house, the land, the 2 horses, a dog named Biscuit who was mostly worthless as a working animal but extraordinarily good at sleeping in patches of sunlight, and she had her own 2 capable hands, which she had come to rely on more than anything else in the world. The leak had started on the 2nd day of the October rain. It began as a dark stain spreading across the ceiling above the kitchen, an innocent enough thing at first, just a brown shadow that might have been nothing at all. But by evening, it was dripping steadily into the bucket she had positioned underneath it, and by the morning of the 3rd day, it was dripping so hard and so constantly that she had run out of buckets and was using every pot she owned, and the sound of rain striking metal at 7 different pitches had begun to drive her quietly out of her mind. She had sent word to Hector the day before, asking if he could spare one of his ranch hands to take a look, but Hector's boy had come back with the news that 2 of the hands had gone into town, and the 3rd had sprained his wrist, and Hector himself was down with a chest cold, and Mrs. Danning was insisting he stay in bed. There was no one else nearby. The next farm over belonged to the Whitfield family, but the Whitfields had pulled up stakes in August and headed for Colorado, and their place sat empty and silent behind a fence that was already starting to lean. So Elvira Turner looked at the rain coming down outside her window, looked at the pots and buckets arranged across her kitchen floor like some strange musical instrument, looked at her daughter Clara sitting on the rug with her cornhusk doll, and made a decision. She put Clara down for her nap early, tucking the blanket up under her chin and pressing a kiss to her forehead and saying, "You sleep now, sweetheart. Mama has some work to do." Then she went to the barn and found the old shingles George had kept there, the leftover ones from when he had redone one section of the roof 3 years back. There were a half dozen of them, enough to patch whatever had gone wrong up there. She found the hammer. She found the nails, a handful of cut nails in a tin can on the workbench shelf. She found the long wooden ladder that George had built against the barn wall and dragged it out through the rain to the side of the house. The rain was cold and steady. It was not a violent storm, not the kind with lightning and wind that would have sent anyone sensible indoors without a second thought. It was just the relentless, patient kind of Texas autumn rain that could fall for a week without ever raising its voice. The kind that soaked through everything slowly and permanently, the way grief did. Elvira tucked the nails into her apron pocket, looped the hammer through the pocket as well since the handle was long enough to catch, gathered the shingles under one arm and started climbing. The ladder was slippery. The rungs were wet and her boots were not made for this kind of work, but she was careful and slow, testing each step before she committed her weight to it. She had climbed trees as a girl in Georgia, and she had climbed the fence at the top of the south pasture during the roundup last spring, and she was not afraid of heights in the abstract. What she was afraid of, in a quiet and practical way, was falling, and so she did not fall. She made it up the side of the house and onto the lower slope of the roof, moving carefully on the wet shingles, keeping low, keeping her weight distributed, using the peaks and ridges of the roofline to anchor herself. The damage was not hard to find once she got up there. 3 shingles had cracked and split, one completely missing, probably blown away in the storm that had come through in September and that she had not thought serious enough to inspect afterward. She should have checked then. She knew that now, kneeling in the rain on her own roof with water running down the back of her neck and soaking through her skirt and her blouse and probably her boots, feeling the cold settle into her bones with a thoroughness that would probably mean a headache by tomorrow. She started pulling the damaged shingles free, working the hammer claw under the edges to pry the old nails loose. The wood was soft where it had been wet, easier to work with than dry shingles would have been, and she found her rhythm after the first one, working methodically, not rushing, because rushing on a wet roof was how a person ended up with a broken wrist or a cracked skull on the red clay below. Clayton Weston saw her from the road. He had been riding the county road that ran past the Turner property since just after noon, heading toward Harlan's Crossing from the south, where he had spent the past 3 weeks working a cattle drive for a rancher named Alderman who ran a big operation down in Uvalde. The cattle drive had ended early because Alderman had gotten a better price at a closer market than expected, and Clayton found himself with his wages in his pocket, and the road north open before him, and no particular reason not to follow it toward a town he had been meaning to visit for 2 years, where an old friend from his army days had opened a livery stable and had written to say there might be steady work available if Clayton was tired of driving cattle. Clayton was 31 years old, and he was not exactly tired of driving cattle, but he was tired of the kind of life that meant you never slept in the same place twice and never had a reason to know anyone's name for longer than a season. He had spent 6 years as a cavalry soldier after the war, then 5 years drifting from outfit to outfit, taking work where he found it, which was almost always, because he was good with horses and better with cattle and reliable enough that the word of it had spread ahead of him through the network of ranch foremen and trail bosses who talked to each other at every stop between Texas and Kansas. He was a tall man, built lean but solid the way working men get, with brown hair that had been overdue for a cut since July and dark eyes that were watchful without being unfriendly. He had a face that had been outdoors his whole life, wind-burned and sun-lined, the face of a man who had spent more of his years under the sky than under a roof. He had scars on his hands from wire work and trail work, and the ordinary accumulated violence of a life done mostly on horseback. He was riding a big gray horse named Amos, who was the one thing in Clayton's life that could be described as a prized possession without exaggeration, a horse he had bought off a Comanche trader 3 years ago when the horse was a half-broken 4-year-old, and that Clayton had spent months working into the steadiest, surest animal he had ever ridden. Amos did not spook at much of anything, which was a quality Clayton valued highly. The road ran along a fence line, and through the fence Clayton could see a farmhouse, and beyond it a barn, and beyond everything else the gray curtain of rain, and he was just thinking about how far it still was to town, and whether the road would flood at the creek crossing, when he glanced up at the farmhouse roof and saw her. At first his mind did not entirely process what it was seeing. A figure on a rooftop in the rain was not a thing that fit naturally into the landscape of a rainy October afternoon, and his brain needed a moment to catch up. Then he understood. A woman, clearly a woman from the shape of her skirts, which were dark with rain and flattened against her legs by the weight of the water, kneeling on the slope of a roof some 15 feet above the ground, hammering at something with what appeared to be a hammer, while it rained, hard enough to see the drops hitting the puddles in the yard from the road. Clayton Weston, who had ridden through stampedes and river crossings and one memorable ambush by cattle thieves without losing his seat on a horse, nearly came off Amos entirely. He grabbed the saddle horn with one hand, and Amos, bless him, just stopped walking and stood there patiently in the road while Clayton reorganized himself and processed the situation. A woman on a roof, in the rain, alone, clearly trying to repair something, clearly managing it, because from what he could see, she was moving with the careful, deliberate competence of someone who knew what they were doing, but still, a woman on a roof in the rain, and there was a ladder leaning against the side of the house, and the ground below was slick red clay, and if she slipped, he did not finish that thought. He turned Amos off the road, through the gate that stood open at the end of the lane, and rode hard up the lane toward the house. Elvira heard the hoofbeats before she heard the voice, and she turned carefully on the roof, sitting back on her heels to keep her balance, one hand braced against the peak of the roofline. A rider was coming up her lane at a canter, a big gray horse, a man she did not recognize. She tightened her grip on the hammer instinctively. 17 months of widowhood had taught her to notice the tension that came from being a woman alone on a piece of land. The rider pulled up short at the foot of the ladder, and the horse stood absolutely still, rain running off its haunches in sheets, and the man looked up at her with an expression that she would later describe to Clara as the look of a man who had just seen something that broke several of the rules he thought governed how the world worked. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was loud enough to carry over the rain, but he kept it level and careful, the way you talk to someone in a precarious position when you do not want to startle them. "Are you all right up there?" "I am perfectly fine," she said, which was true enough since she had not fallen. "I am fixing my roof." He looked at her for another moment. He looked at the rain. He looked back at her. "I can see that," he said. "I'm wondering if it might be something I could help with." "Do you know how to lay shingles?" He blinked. "I do." "Then tie your horse and come up," she said, and turned back to her work. There was a brief pause below her, and then she heard him moving, heard the sound of him securing the horse to the porch post, heard the ladder creak as he tested it, and then his footsteps on the rungs, and then the creak and shift of the roof as he came up beside her. He was taller than she had estimated from below and broader through the shoulders. His hat was dark with rain and the brim was dripping freely. He looked at what she had done so far, the 3 damaged shingles she had already removed, the new ones stacked beside her, and he nodded once. "You want me to nail these down?" he asked. "I want you to fit them and nail them down," she corrected. "If you just nail without checking the fit, you'll have another leak by spring." He looked at her again, and there was something in his expression that she would not identify until later, a kind of awakening recognition, as though he had expected one thing and encountered something else entirely, something better. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and picked up the first shingle. They worked together on that roof in the rain for the better part of an hour. He was good at it, better than she had expected, and she told him so, which made him give a brief, surprised kind of smile that did something unexpected to the usual composition of his face. He told her he had built more than a few structures in his time. She told him it showed. They passed nails back and forth in the way of people who are accustomed to working alongside others, without ceremony, without waste of motion. At one point she misjudged the slope and started to slide, just a few inches, just enough to get her heart into her throat, and his hand shot out and caught her elbow before she had even finished the motion of sliding, fast and sure and steady. He held on for a moment until she had regained her footing, and then he released her with a kind of careful deliberateness, as though he was aware of the fact of touching her and wanted to be respectful of it. "Thank you," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. When they had finished, all 6 shingles in place and nailed solid, the damaged wood beneath them sealed as well as it could be sealed without a full re-roofing, they came down the ladder one at a time in the rain, him first because he moved faster and she was more careful, and stood at the bottom looking at each other. The rain was still falling. They were both soaked through to their respective bones. "I haven't got a lot to offer by way of hospitality right now," she said, wringing a handful of water out of the hem of her skirt with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who has long since stopped being surprised by what life requires her to deal with. "But I have coffee on the stove, and I believe there is still some cornbread from this morning." "I don't need feeding," he said. "I didn't ask if you needed it," she said. "I said I had it. Those are different things." He looked at her with those dark, watchful eyes. "I'm Clayton Weston," he said. "I was riding through to Harlan's Crossing." "Elvira Turner," she said. "And you have arrived at the Turner place, which is 1 mile short of Harlan's Crossing. So you might as well come in and warm up before you finish the ride." He tied Amos under the porch overhang where the horse was out of the worst of the rain, and he followed her inside. Clara woke up from her nap while they were drinking coffee, stumbling out of the bedroom with her dark hair tangled and one cheek pink and creased from the pillow, dragging the cornhusk doll by one arm. She stopped and looked at Clayton with the frank, undefended curiosity of a 4-year-old. "Who are you?" she asked. "Clayton Weston," he said. "Who are you?" "Clara Turner," she said. "That's my mama." "I know," he said. "I just met her on the roof." Clara looked at her mother and then back at Clayton. "Mama was on the roof again," she said, in the tone of a person reporting a known recurring condition. "She does that." "Again?" Elvira said. "You went up in April too," Clara said, with the devastating precision of 4-year-olds who have no understanding of what information is and is not helpful to share. "When the bird got stuck." Clayton looked at Elvira over his coffee cup, and there was a smile beginning in the corner of his mouth that he was visibly trying to suppress. And she felt, against her will and contrary to her intentions, a laugh pressing up from inside her chest. "There was a grackle that got trapped under the roof line," she said with great dignity. "It needed to be freed before it died up there." "Of course it did," he said, and now the smile was winning the battle with the rest of his face, and she let her own laugh out then, surprising herself with the sound of it, because she had not laughed that freely in longer than she could remember. He stayed for supper. She had not intended to invite him, but Clara asked with the perfectly weaponized shamelessness of children whether Mr. Weston would like to eat with them, and Elvira found herself unable to present a reasonable argument against it. She fried the last of the salt pork and made biscuits, and opened a jar of preserved peaches she had been saving for a special occasion, though she would not have been able to say why this qualified as one. It just seemed to. He ate the way a man eats who has been on the trail and not had a decent meal in days, steadily and gratefully, and without making a spectacle of his hunger. He talked to Clara with a patience and attentiveness that surprised Elvira, answering her questions about his horse and where he had been, and whether he had ever seen a real bear with the same seriousness that you might bring to a conversation with an adult. Clara was charmed by him in the total, uncomplicated way that children can be charmed by people who pay them genuine attention. Elvira watched him while she washed the dishes, and she thought about how long it had been since there had been a man at her supper table who was not old Hector Danning talking about cattle prices. She thought about the sound his voice made in the room, filling the quiet that she had gotten so accustomed to that she had stopped noticing it was quiet. She thought that he had good hands, working hands, competent hands, the kind that had caught her arm on the roof with a sure and thoughtless accuracy that still lived in the muscles of her elbow. She stopped thinking about his hands and finished the dishes. The rain did not let up. By the time supper was finished and Clara was drowsing in the armchair by the fire, it was dark outside and the road to Harlan's Crossing would be a genuine hazard. The creek crossing that lay between the Turner place and town was low-banked and flooded easily, and Elvira thought about George riding through a rainstorm and not coming home, and she said, before she had fully made the decision to say it, "You could sleep in the barn tonight. It's dry enough in there and the rain won't be through by morning." He looked at her steadily. "I don't want to impose. You fixed my roof," she said. "One night in the barn is a fair trade." There was a pause. "That's a practical way to look at it," he said. "I'm a practical woman," she said. He nodded, and there was that near smile again, the one that seemed to come from somewhere genuine and maybe slightly surprised. "I'll take the barn then. Thank you, Mrs. Turner." "Elvira," she said, and then caught herself and added, "if you like," which she felt was a reasonable modification. "Elvira," he said, and the way he said her name, quietly and with a kind of care that she had not been expecting, did something to the air in the room that she was not entirely prepared for. She gave him a spare blanket and a candle in a tin holder, and she watched from the porch as he walked across the yard to the barn in the dark rain, Amos's reins in his hand, the two of them picking their way across the muddy yard with a quiet companionship that she found, for some reason, almost unbearably sad and sweet at the same time. She put Clara to bed and lay in her own bed listening to the rain on the roof, and the roof did not leak. Somewhere below in the barn, a man she had met 4 hours ago was sleeping in the hay, and she felt, settling around her like something that had been in the cold for a long time and was just now beginning to warm, a thing she had not felt in so long that she was not immediately sure what to call it. The word she finally arrived at, just before she fell asleep, was less alone. In the morning the rain had stopped. The sky was the washed, clear blue that comes after long autumn rains, fragile and bright, and the yard was a catastrophe of mud that she was going to have to navigate carefully for the next several days. Clayton was up before she was, which she discovered when she came out onto the porch with the idea of checking on the livestock, and found that the livestock had already been checked on, the chickens fed, the water trough scraped clean and refilled from the well, and Amos in the adjacent pasture with her 2 horses, all 3 of them grazing with the placid unconcern of animals who have gotten what they need. Clayton himself was at the fence at the edge of the south pasture, looking at the cattle. He heard her come around the side of the house and turned, and in the early morning light after the rain, he looked different than he had in the dim kitchen the evening before. Cleaner somehow, though she knew that made no sense since he had spent the night in a barn, just more visible perhaps, more present. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said. "I hope you don't mind about the horses. I thought they could use some air after being shut up." "I don't mind at all," she said. "Thank you for the feeding." He looked back at the cattle. "You've got a good little herd here," he said. "That black and white one looks like she might be close to calving." Elvira looked at the cow he was indicating, the one she called Matilda, who had been looking broad and low and uncomfortable for the past week. "I know," she said. "I've been watching her. She should have a few more weeks yet, but this weather might push things along." He nodded, the nod of someone who knew cattle and had just gotten a piece of information that mattered. "You manage this place yourself?" he asked, and his tone was careful enough that the question did not feel like anything except genuine curiosity. "With some help from my neighbor, Hector Danning, when things get beyond me," she said. "And things get beyond me less often than you might expect." He looked at her sideways. "I don't know that I expected much of anything in particular," he said. "I'd say you've shown me pretty clearly what kind of person you are." She was not sure what exactly he meant by that, but the way he said it carried a weight that she was fairly certain was positive, and she decided to accept it on those terms. "You were heading to Harlan's Crossing," she said. You should go before the creek crossing gets any muddier." "I was," he said. "I am." He paused. "I wonder if you might have need of an extra hand around here, though. I'm not in any particular hurry." She looked at him. He looked at her. The sun was coming up orange over the top of the live oaks to the east, and somewhere in the tree line, a mockingbird was running through its entire repertoire in a burst of post-strain enthusiasm. "I haven't got much to pay," she said honestly. "I'm not asking for much," he said, equally honest. "Why?" she asked, because she was a practical woman and practical women asked direct questions. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the cattle, looking at the sky, looking at something she could not quite see. "Because I've been moving so long I'm not sure I remember how to stop," he said finally. "And I think maybe I should try and find out." It was the most honest thing she had ever heard a man she had just met say to her, and it knocked something sideways in her chest. "There's fence to mend on the east side," she said. "The bottom rail has been giving me trouble since September. And I was going to have to get someone to look at the well rope before winter. It's fraying." "I can do both those things," he said. "Then you can stay a while," she said. "The barn is decent enough." "It was fine," he said. "I slept better than I have in a month." She went in to make breakfast, and the mockingbird kept singing, and the mud was already beginning to dry at the edges where the morning sun hit it, and Elvira Turner felt, for the first time in a long time, as though the world was doing something other than shrinking. He stayed for a week, then 2 weeks. Then the calendar turned to November and he was still there, and neither of them had said anything about it directly, because there was always another thing that needed doing, and the doing of it seemed reason enough to stay another day. He fixed the fence. He repaired the well rope with a careful, patient attention to the fraying sections, unwinding them and resplicing the good fibers until the rope was as strong as it had been when it was new. He cleared the drainage ditch along the north side of the yard that had gotten clogged with leaves and debris over the summer and had been directing runoff toward the foundation of the house. He repaired the chicken coop door that had been hanging crooked since spring. He did all of it without being asked more than once, and often without being asked at all, because he had the gift of seeing what needed doing and doing it, which was a quality Elvira had come to understand was rarer than it seemed. He was quiet in the mornings and more talkative in the evenings. He told her about the places he had been, Kansas and Colorado, and a stretch of time in New Mexico territory that he described briefly and without apparent pleasure, just as a thing that had happened. He had been born in Kentucky before the war, and the war had scrambled his sense of home so thoroughly that he had never quite found it again afterward. He had a brother in Missouri who sent a letter occasionally and received one in return, and that was about the extent of his family. She told him about Georgia, about the farm her father had worked, about the school she had attended until she was 16, about meeting George Turner at a church social, and marrying him 6 months later and following him west because he had a dream. And she had the kind of faith in dreams that youth produces before reality has had a chance to refine it. She told him that she did not regret any of it, because George had been a good man and this land was good land and Clara was better than anything she could have imagined. And she said all of it simply and without performance, the way you say things that are true. He listened the way he worked, with full attention and no wasted motion. Clara had decided early that Clayton Weston was one of the best people she had ever encountered, a determination she made primarily on the basis of his willingness to spend an entire hour one afternoon helping her build a stick fort for her cornhusk doll, and his sincere admiration for the result. He carved her a little wooden horse one evening after supper, just a rough one, nothing fancy, out of a piece of cedar he found in the woodpile, and the way Clara's face opened up when he handed it to her was something that hit Elvira in the chest so hard she had to look away. Hector Danning came by in the middle of November, bundled up in his winter coat, his arthritic hands wrapped in heavy gloves, riding slowly on his old brown mare. He looked at Clayton with the measuring, unhurried assessment of a man who had spent decades determining what people were made of by looking at them. And then he looked at Elvira. "This your new hand," he said. "Clayton Weston," Clayton said, and offered his hand. Hector shook it and spent another moment looking at him. "You treating her fair," he said, with a directness that seemed to embarrass Clayton slightly but did not throw him. "Trying to," Clayton said. Hector looked at Elvira. Elvira looked back at him with the steady gaze of a woman who knew what he was assessing and had no objection to the assessment but did not intend to be managed. Hector nodded, satisfied with whatever he had found. "Come spring, those east pasture posts need replacing," he told her, and she said she knew. And he sat with them for coffee and told Clayton 3 separate stories about this particular piece of land and its particular challenges, which Clayton listened to with the respect due to actual expertise. And Hector left before dark riding his slow mare home looking, Elvira thought, slightly more at ease about the state of the Turner place than he had been. December came with its cold nights and its short days, and something shifted between Elvira and Clayton that neither of them had articulated but both of them felt, a growing weight to their time together, a gravity. The evenings by the fire after Clara was in bed had become a fixed part of the day's architecture, the two of them with their coffee, and sometimes the newspaper that came on the monthly stage from San Antonio, reading and talking and sitting in a silence that had stopped being the silence of strangers and become something else, something with warmth in it. She caught herself watching him sometimes when he didn't know it, watching the way he moved, careful and deliberate, nothing wasted. Watching the way he talked to Clara, always at her level, always genuinely interested in whatever Clara thought was important. Watching his hands, those competent hands, and then feeling foolish for it and looking away. He caught himself watching her too, though she might not have known it. Watching her in the mornings when she was working through her day's list with the brisk, organized competence of someone who has learned to be their own best help. Watching her laugh at something Clara said, the way her whole face changed when she laughed, the way it erased the lines that worry and grief and hard work had drawn there, and let him see the woman she had been before life had asked so much of her, and the woman she still was, both of them present at once. Watching her at the end of the day when she sat by the fire, and her shoulders came down from the set they held all day and she let herself rest, and she looked softer then, not weaker, but softer, as though the keeping it together could be set down for a few hours, and she was willing to let him see that. He had not planned to fall in love with her. He had not planned anything in particular, which had been the general organizing principle of the last decade of his life, and perhaps that was partly why it happened, because he had arrived here without a strategy, without defenses arranged, and she had been so relentlessly herself, so unapologetic and capable and funny in the dry way she had, and he had been on that fence with her before he understood what the fence was for. She had not planned it either. She had not been looking for it. She had told herself in the early weeks that what she felt was gratitude for the help, and then that it was the natural warmth that comes from having another adult human being to talk to after so long of managing alone, and then she had run out of reasonable explanations and had to sit with the thing itself. The night it became undeniable was a Thursday in December, cold enough that the water bucket by the door had a skim of ice on it by morning. Clara had gotten a cough earlier in the week, nothing serious, just the kind that children get in the cold months, but Elvira had spent 2 nights listening for it in the dark, the way mothers do, that hyper-alert animal listening that does not fully sleep. She had been tired and it had showed, and Clayton had noticed. He had taken over more of the evening chores without being asked, and after supper when she had fallen asleep in the chair by the fire with her mending in her lap, he had sat quietly on the other side of the fire and not woken her. She woke after an hour or so, disoriented. The mending slid off her lap and found him reading by the firelight, and the fire had been built up carefully while she slept, and there was a cup of coffee on the small table beside her chair, still warm, kept warm by the proximity of the fire. She looked at the coffee and then at him, and he looked up from the newspaper and met her eyes, and she thought that she had not cried in front of another person since the week after George died, and she was not going to cry now. But the fact of the coffee, the simple, careful fact of it, the fact that he had thought about it and done it without announcement, broke something open in her in a way that she was not entirely in control of. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she intended. He put the newspaper down. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "I'm just tired." "I know you are," he said gently. And she looked at him and he looked at her across the fire, and neither of them looked away. And the thing that had been growing between them for 2 months was suddenly just there, in the room, plainly visible and requiring acknowledgement. And Elvira felt the old reflex rise, the one that said to be practical, to be sensible, to be careful. And she felt it rise and felt herself not follow it, which was a new and frightening and entirely necessary thing. "Clayton," she said. "Elvira," he said. And there it was, just their names, just the two of them across the fire, and it was more honest than either of them had managed to be yet. "I don't know what this is," she said. "What's been happening?" "I think you know," he said, and his voice was quiet and direct and not unkind. She did know. She had known for weeks. "I have Clara," she said, not as an obstacle exactly, but as the central fact of her life that any other fact had to be organized around. "I know you do," he said. "And I've been managing this place alone for 18 months, she said. "I don't want to need somebody. I don't mean that harshly. I just mean I've had to stop needing things in order to keep going, and I don't know how to start again." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I understand that better than you might think. I've been alone a long time by choice, because it was easier. Because needing a place to be and having it taken from you or leaving it yourself hurts more than never having had it." She looked at him carefully. "George dying," she said, because she was going to say the real thing, "broke me in some ways that are not entirely fixed. I'm honest about that." "I'm not asking you to be fixed," he said. "I'm not fixed either. I'm not sure the people who have really lived are." She felt the warmth of that, the extraordinary simple relief of someone saying that out loud. "What are you asking?" she said. He looked at the fire for a moment and then back at her. "I'm asking if I can stay," he said, "not just for the fence and the well rope. I'm asking if there's a place here for me that's more than a hired hand sleeping in the barn." The fire cracked and shifted. Outside, the wind was moving through the oaks. Somewhere in the bedroom, Clara coughed once and then was quiet, and both of them listened until the silence confirmed that she had settled back to sleep. "I believe there might be," Elvira said, "but I need to be honest with you. I am 30 years old and I have a 4-year-old daughter and 12 head of cattle and a tendency to climb roofs in the rain. And I need a man who is in this place on purpose, not because the road happened to run past my fence line." "The road running past your fence line was the best accident of my life," he said, "but I hear what you're saying. And I need time," she said, "real time, not for politeness or because it's proper to wait, but because I want to be sure. I owe Clara that, I owe myself that." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I haven't wanted to go anywhere since the morning after that first night." She believed him. That was the thing about Clayton Weston, she thought, that everything he said seemed to come from the same place, the same honest, unornamented core, and she had spent enough time with liars and performers and well-meaning people who said what sounded right to recognize the difference when it was in front of her. "Then stay," she said, "and let's see what this is." He nodded slowly, and the smile that crossed his face was the most unguarded one she had seen from him yet, wide and real and slightly undone, and she thought that she liked him enormously, which was perhaps the best foundation for anything. They did not rush it. January came and went with its cold and its short days, and they continued as they had been, him in the barn, her in the house, the evenings by the fire, the days full of work. But with the understanding between them now laid plainly on the table, they moved differently within it. There were small new things. He had started joining them for meals from the beginning, but now there was less performance about it, less of the polite guest and more of the comfortable presence. He helped Clara learn to read from the primer that Elvira had been working through with her. And Clara, who was fierce about certain things and stubborn about others, took to reading with a determination that delighted both adults and produced evenings in which she sat between them on the settee and read aloud from the primer with a solemn pride that was one of the loveliest things Elvira had ever seen. He touched her hand once, crossing through the barn on the way to check on Matilda the cow, whose calving time had finally arrived. Just her hand, just briefly, just the pressure of his fingers over hers for a moment as they both reached for the lantern at the same time. And then they both pulled back and kept walking. But the warmth of it stayed with her through the whole process of sitting with the cow, and talking her through the labor, and watching the calf come into the world slick and dark and alive in the lantern light. "It's a heifer," Clayton said, kneeling in the hay beside the calf and touching the animal's still wet side with a gentleness that Elvira watched and filed away in the collection of things she knew about him. "Strong one." "Good," Elvira said. "That's good." They looked at each other over the new calf, and the lantern swung slightly in the barn draft, and it was cold and smelled of hay and cattle and winter, and it was one of the most completely alive moments Elvira could remember in years. In February he kissed her, which she had been thinking about for some weeks in a way she would not have admitted to anyone including herself. It was an evening after Clara was in bed, and they were standing on the porch looking at the stars, which were extraordinary in that particular patch of Texas sky, brilliantly clear and numberless, the kind of sky that made you understand why people had always looked up and felt things. He had said something about a particular star, some navigation thing he had learned in the cavalry, and she had leaned over to follow the line of his pointing finger. And when she straightened, she found that she had turned into him somehow, and he was very close. And they looked at each other for a moment with the specific kind of attention that means something is about to happen. He kissed her carefully and briefly, just his mouth on hers in the cold February air, and then he pulled back to see what she thought about it. "That was a long time coming," she said. "Was it too long?" he asked. "No," she said. "It was the right amount of time." He kissed her again, less briefly this time, and she let herself have it, that warmth, that specific gravity of being someone's center of attention in that particular way, the feeling she had thought she might have folded up and put away for good. She had not. It had just been waiting, as things do, for the right time and the right person. He asked her to marry him in March. The timing was not poetic. It was in the middle of a conversation about the east pasture fence posts that Hector had mentioned in November, which had circled back around to being an urgent topic since the spring grass was coming in and the cattle needed to be moved. He said it in the way that he said most things, directly and without elaborate preamble, though she could see in his face that he was not entirely at ease with the uncertainty of it. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to be here. I want to be Clara's father if she'll have me, and I want to build the rest of my life on this particular piece of ground with you. I know you said you needed time, and I've tried to respect that, and I'll keep respecting it if you say it's not enough yet. But I needed you to know what I want." Elvira was quiet for a moment. They were standing at the edge of the south pasture, and the spring was coming in green and sweet around them, and the cattle were moving slow and unhurried in the early morning light, and Clara was in the house with her primer. "I want to ask Clara," she said. "Not because her answer would be the final word, because I'm her mother and I'll make the decision that's right for both of us, but because she deserves to be considered." "That's the right instinct," he said. That evening, after supper, she sat with Clara on the settee and said, "How would you feel if Clayton stayed here for always? Not just as somebody who helps us, but as part of our family." Clara looked at her with the dark, thoughtful eyes that were so like George's. "Like a papa," she said. "Something like that," Elvira said carefully. "He wouldn't be your papa who is in heaven, he would be something new." Clara was quiet for a moment in the way that small children are quiet when they are doing genuine thinking. "Would he still help me with my letters?" she asked. "I believe so," Elvira said. "And would he keep Amos here?" "I would imagine so." Clara nodded with the decisive certainty of a 4-year-old who has reached a conclusion. "I think that would be good," she said. "I think we should keep him." Elvira laughed and called Clayton in from the porch where he had been giving them privacy, and Clara looked at him with the sublime confidence of a child who has just made a decision and said, "We're keeping you." And Clayton looked at her and then at Elvira, and his face did the thing it did sometimes. The thing that was not quite the near smile but was something bigger and less controlled, and he said very quietly, "All right then." They were married in May at the small church in Harlan's Crossing by Reverend Mills, who was a spare and serious man but who had a fondness for conducting weddings because they were, he said, the most hopeful thing that people did. Hector Danning and his wife Alma were there, Alma crying with the enthusiasm of a woman who had been hoping for this outcome since December, and the Reverend Mills's wife, and 3 or 4 townspeople who had come to know Elvira over her years in the county and who wished her well. Clara wore a white dress that Elvira had sewn from a length of cotton goods she had ordered specially, and she stood very straight and serious during the ceremony, holding the wooden horse that Clayton had carved her, which she considered her finest possession. Elvira wore blue, a deep blue cotton dress she had sewn herself as well, and she had put her dark hair up and fixed a small cluster of wildflowers in it that Clara had picked from the meadow that morning, with the solemnity of a person performing an important task. She walked into that church not as a woman being given to someone, but as a woman choosing, which felt entirely different. And she stood next to Clayton Weston, who was wearing the clean shirt he had bought in town for the occasion, and who was looking at her with an expression that she had never seen on anyone's face directed at her before, a kind of contained, solemn wonder, as though he was genuinely not sure he had earned this, and was determined to spend the rest of his life trying to deserve it. She made her vows looking at his face and meaning every word of them, not the false hope meaning of youth before you know what vows cost, but the clear-eyed, full-grown meaning of a woman who has lost things and found things, and come to understand the weight of a promise. He made his vows looking at her, and feeling the strange and entirely unfamiliar sensation of being exactly where he was supposed to be, in a specific place with a specific person, with a future that had a shape and a direction and other people's names in it. The weight of it did not frighten him. It was the good weight of something real. After the ceremony there was food at the church hall, contributions from half the women in Harlan's Crossing who felt that a widow remarrying after hard years deserved a proper celebration. There was cake, a real one, 2 layers, that Alma Danning had baked and iced. Clara ate 3 pieces of cake and then fell asleep in a chair in the corner, still clutching the wooden horse, and Clayton carried her out to the wagon without waking her and covered her with a blanket, and came back inside to dance with his wife, slowly, to the fiddle music that old Jedediah Creek played in the corner. 1 song that turned into 3 that turned into however many songs it takes before newlyweds feel they have stayed long enough and can go home. Home. Elvira thought about that word on the ride back to the ranch, sitting next to Clayton on the wagon seat in the May evening with Clara asleep in the back and the stars coming out overhead. The ranch was the same as it had always been. The house, the barn, the pasture, the fence that now had new posts on the east side. But it had a different feeling to it as they drove up the lane, or perhaps it was she who had a different feeling, she who had been subtly rearranged by the day's events into a configuration that included more room in it than she had allowed herself in quite a long time. He helped her carry Clara inside and put her to bed, and they stood together in the doorway of the child's room for a moment looking at her, small and dark-haired and peacefully asleep, the wooden horse tucked under her arm. "She's extraordinary," Clayton said quietly. "She is," Elvira agreed. "She looks like you," he said, "around the mouth. People usually say she looks like George. She has his eyes," he said, "but the stubbornness around the mouth is all yours." She laughed softly so as not to wake Clara, and he took her hand in the dark hallway, her husband's hand, warm and certain, and she held it back, Summer that year was the richest and fullest one Elvira could remember. The cattle herd grew with 3 more calves, Matilda's heifer and 2 from other cows, and Clayton had ideas about the operation, careful, practical ideas based on what he had learned from 8 years of cattle work, about rotating the pastures and improving the breeding stock, that she listened to and argued with and refined with him the way partners do when they both know things and respect what the other one knows. They were good at it, that kind of collaboration, the respectful, energetic kind where disagreement is not a threat but a tool. He went to work formally in town as well, 3 days a week at the livery stable that his friend from the Army days, a man named Ed Byers, had been running. The job had still been there, which surprised Clayton, though Ed explained that he had been waiting for him because Clayton was the only person Ed trusted to manage the horses the way they needed managing. It brought in some additional income that Elvira put to work on the things she had been putting off: a new flue for the kitchen stove, some additional fencing, a proper window glass for the east bedroom that had had an oilcloth panel since one of last winter's cold snaps had broken the original. Clara started at the schoolhouse in Harlan's Crossing that September, the one-room school run by a young teacher named Miss Pryor who had come from Austin and who was alarmed and then impressed by the degree to which Clara already knew her letters. Clara took to school the way she took to most things, with a fierce, total engagement that left no room for anything else while she was inside it, and she came home every day full of information and opinions. It was a good life. It was the kind of good that is made of accumulations of ordinary days rather than dramatic events, the kind of good that is built by people who show up for each other consistently and without fanfare. And Elvira appreciated it with a full understanding of what the alternative looked like, because she had lived the alternative, and she knew the weight of what was missing when it was gone. Clayton came home from town on a Thursday evening in October, which was almost exactly a year from the day he had seen her on the roof, and she told him that she was expecting. She told him after supper, after Clara was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and she said it plainly and directly the way she said everything, watching his face. His face did the thing that she had never entirely gotten accustomed to, the thing where everything he usually kept composed came briefly and entirely undone, and he sat there for a moment just looking at her, and then he reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his. "Elvira," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "I'm better than fine. I wanted to be sure before I said anything, so I've had a few weeks with it already. I'm all right with it." More than all right. He brought her hands up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, a gesture so tender and precise that she felt it move through her from the point of contact outward, and he said, not quite evenly, "I don't know what I did to get here." "You climbed up on my roof in the rain," she said. He laughed, the real laugh that she had come to love, the one that was full and unself-conscious and made him look younger than he was. "I did," he said. "Best decision I ever made." "The second best," she said. "The best was saying yes to coffee." "You didn't exactly give me a choice about the coffee," he said. "I didn't," she agreed. He held her hands and looked at her in the lamplight, and she looked back at him. And outside the October wind was moving through the live oaks, and the roof was not leaking, because he had checked it when the summer ended and replaced 2 more shingles that were starting to go, and the house was warm, and their daughter was asleep in the next room, and the world was a specific and particular and astonishing place. Clara took the news of the coming baby with the judicious gravity of a child who has considered the matter seriously. Her first question was whether it would be a boy or a girl. When told that no one knew yet, she considered this for a while and then said that she supposed either would be acceptable, but that if it was a boy she was going to need more time to get used to the idea. Clayton told her that was very reasonable and that he would pass along her preference. It became a running exchange between them over the months of the winter, Clara providing increasingly specific conditions under which a boy sibling would be tolerable, including the requirement that he not touch her wooden horse without asking, that he not be allowed to attend school before he was ready, and that he be named something respectable and not silly. Clayton agreed to all of these terms with the seriousness that Clara's negotiations always deserved. The baby was born in June of 1880, a boy, in the bedroom of the farmhouse with Alma Danning serving as midwife in the capable, matter-of-fact way she had served that purpose for half the women in the county over the past 20 years. It was a hard labor, long and exhausting, and Clayton spent most of it in the kitchen where Alma had exiled him on the grounds that he was underfoot, but where he could hear enough to know how things were going, and the not knowing specifically was its own particular form of suffering that he bore in silence, because there was nothing useful he could do with it. When Alma finally came to the kitchen doorway and said, "A boy, Mr. Weston. They're both fine," he sat down heavily in the chair that was behind him and spent a moment looking at his own hands. "Mr. Weston," Alma said more gently, "you can go in." Elvira was pale and exhausted and more beautiful than he had ever seen her, which was something he would never entirely be able to explain to anyone else. She was holding the baby, and the baby was very small and very red and was making the series of sounds that new babies make, sounds that are somewhere between complaint and wonder. "Come see him," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at the small person she was holding, and the small person seemed to consider this with narrow-eyed skepticism, and Clayton thought that the expression was already somehow familiar. "He looks like he's thinking very hard about something," he said. "He's been doing that since about midnight," Elvira said. "What do you want to name him?" She had thought about it for months, turning possibilities over. "I'd like to call him William," she said. "William George Weston." He looked at her. "George," he said, understanding what she was doing, giving the child her first husband's name as part of his name, honoring what had been while building what was new. "George was a good man," she said simply. "And Clara's father, I don't want her to think we've forgotten him." He nodded and felt the rightness of it settle. "William George Weston," he said. "Yes." Clara was allowed in to meet her brother that afternoon, approaching the bed with an expression of careful scientific interest that shifted. When Elvira laid the baby in her arms while she sat carefully supported against the headboard, into something that went quiet and soft and entirely unguarded. She looked at him for a long time without saying anything. "He's very small," she said finally. "He'll grow," Elvira said. "Does he know his name?" "Not yet," Clayton said. "You can tell him." Clara looked down at the baby with the gravity of someone taking on an important task. "Your name is William George Weston," she said clearly and directly. "And I'm your sister. I have conditions about the wooden horse." William George Weston blinked at her with the unfocused, swimming attention of the newborn, and then his face crinkled and he sneezed. And Clara shrieked with delight so sudden and complete that the baby immediately began to cry. And Elvira laughed despite her exhaustion. And Clayton caught William before Clara could alarm him further, holding him against his shoulder and talking quietly to him until the crying stopped. The way he had learned worked. Low and steady, and with his large warm hand on the baby's small back. Alma Danning, gathering her things by the door, watched all of this and went home and told Hector that the Turner Weston place was doing just fine, which Hector said he had thought for some time, and Alma said she knew he had thought so, but it was nicer than thinking. The years moved through their seasons with the reliable, irreplaceable rhythm of land and life. William was a cheerful baby and a laughing toddler and a determined small boy who had his mother's stubbornness, and his father's quiet watchfulness, and his sister's absolute conviction that the world owed him a full explanation for everything. Clara helped with him with the protective ferocity of big sisters everywhere, policing his safety, narrating his experiences, reading to him from her school books with an authority that he did not yet have the vocabulary to question. In the spring of 1882, Elvira was expecting again. This time it was easier, the labor shorter, and the baby that arrived was a girl, dark-eyed and serious from her first breath, who they named Margaret after Elvira's mother, who had died in Georgia before Elvira had come west. Margaret turned out to be the quietest of the three, watching everything with large dark eyes, and then, when she had formed her opinion, sharing it in complete sentences that were startlingly precise for her age. Clara said Margaret was the smartest person she had ever met, and she had considered many options. Clayton said she might be right, which caused Clara to beam and Margaret to look thoughtful, as though she was reserving judgment. By 1883, the ranch was a different thing than it had been when Elvira was managing it alone. Not unrecognizable, not transformed beyond its essential self, but fuller. There were now 23 cattle on the land, a managed, quality herd with careful breeding choices that Clayton and Elvira made together after long conversations and some disagreement and eventual agreement. The kind of decision-making that comes from two people who trust each other's judgment, even when they do not share each other's initial instincts. There was a new section added to the barn, built by Clayton in the autumn of 1881, with help from Ed Byers and Hector's eldest grandson, who had come to the county that summer. There was a proper garden, expanded from the small kitchen garden Elvira had always kept, that now supplied them through most of the year and produced surplus that she sold in town. The injustice of the territory was not invisible to either of them. They had watched the Comanche and the other nations of the plains be pushed and broken and driven in ways that sat uneasy in the conscience of anyone paying attention, the land taken and lives undone by a government that made and broke promises with a consistency that made the breaking the real policy. Clayton had ridden with the cavalry in that business years ago, and he did not speak of it with pride. He had done what he had been ordered to do in a conflict that he understood now as having been organized entirely to the benefit of those who already had things and to the destruction of those who had lived in this land for generations. He could not undo any of it, and he knew it, but he held it honestly and did not pretend it away, which Elvira thought was the best a man in his position could do. He treated the Mexican workers who passed through the county looking for work with the plain respect of someone who understood what it was to need work and be grateful for it, and he paid fairly when he hired help, which was not universal in that time and place. In the spring of 1884, Clara turned 10 years old and demanded a horse of her own, which Clayton said she would have to earn by demonstrating that she could properly care for one, which Clara received not as a rejection, but as a practical challenge she intended to win, and spent the next 3 months proving she could manage every aspect of horse care to his satisfaction. He bought her a small bay mare in June, and Clara named her Priscilla without explanation, and she and Priscilla were inseparable from that day forward in the way of girls and horses who understand each other. Hector Danning died that summer, quietly in his sleep, which was the best way, Alma said, and she said it without the kind of bitterness that hard losses sometimes produce in people, but with the plain acknowledgement of a woman who had been married to someone for 40 years and understood that the life they had built together was the real thing, and its ending was not a defeat. Elvira went to her every week for a while, bringing food and company and the particular kind of presence that means someone has not been forgotten in their grief. Clayton helped Alma's son manage the Danning place while the family figured out what they were going to do with it, without being asked and without making anything of it. It was the autumn of 1884, almost exactly 6 years since a rider in the rain had seen a woman on a rooftop and nearly lost his seat on his horse getting to her, when Elvira climbed the roof again. It was not an emergency this time. She had been up there to inspect the roofline before winter, as she now did every October, partly because she was thorough and partly because she still preferred to see for herself, and she had found 2 shingles that were starting to go soft at the edges. She was halfway through replacing the first one when she heard Clayton's voice below. "Elvira Turner," he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who has seen something that still, after 6 years, slightly overturns his understanding of how the world operates. She looked down at him from the roof. He was standing at the foot of the ladder with his arms crossed and an expression on his face that was somewhere between exasperation and something else, something warmer that she recognized and never got tired of. "It's Elvira Weston now," she said. "Elvira Weston," he said, "you are standing on a roof." "I am replacing shingles," she said. "I found two that need attention before the winter rain comes. Would you like to hand me the nails, or would you like to continue standing there looking appalled?" He stood there for another moment, shaking his head slightly. Then he picked up the nails from the pile she had left at the base of the ladder and came up. They worked side by side on the roof in the October afternoon, the way they had worked on it the first time in the rain, but differently now, the ease of people who know each other's movements and do not need to negotiate the space between them. The sky was clear and the air was cool, and the view from the rooftop was the pasture and the live oaks and the road in the distance and all the land they had built their life on together. "I remember the first time I came up here," he said, fitting a shingle carefully against the one beside it. "I remember too," she said. "You told me if I wasn't going to fit them properly I might as well not bother," he said. "That was good advice and it held." He smiled at the shingle he was working on. "I thought you were the most remarkable woman I had ever seen in my life. You had known me for about 4 minutes," she said. "It was enough to get a general sense," he said. She looked at him, her husband, kneeling on the roof in the October afternoon, and felt the full weight of him in her life, not the comfortable taken-for-granted weight of habit, but the real weight, the weight of a specific person who had arrived at her fence line by accident and chosen to stay on purpose, who had chosen her and Clara and this land with a deliberateness that she had come to understand was the deepest thing about him, a man who had spent years moving and had finally stopped and meant it. "I thought you were going to fall off your horse when you saw me up here," she said. He laughed. "I very nearly did," he said. "Amos kept me on." "Amos has always been more sensible than me in a crisis." "I should thank him," she said. "He would appreciate the acknowledgement," Clayton said. They finished the shingles and came down the ladder in the late afternoon sun and stood at the bottom, and he was looking at her the way he had looked at her that first morning after the rain, with the wondering attention of someone who cannot quite believe his own good luck, and she reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, which was wind-burned and familiar and the most welcome sight in the world to her. "No regrets," she said, not because she doubted but because she liked asking and liked the answer. "Not one," he said. "Not a single one." She kissed him there at the foot of the ladder in the October afternoon, while the cattle moved in the south pasture, and Biscuit the dog slept in a patch of fading sunlight by the barn door, and Priscilla, the mare, looked over the fence with the tolerant unconcern of a horse who has seen it all. And from inside the house came the sounds of Clara reading to her siblings, William and Margaret, in the bossy, affectionate way she had been reading to them since they were old enough to sit still. The story that Clayton had thought might have ended on one road or another, in one bunkhouse or another, had found its shape here, in this particular place, with these particular people. He had come riding through the rain looking for nothing more specific than a town, and had found the thing he had not known he was looking for, which is perhaps the only reliable way that the essential things are ever found. Elvira had stood on her own roof in the rain and fixed her own leak, because that was who she was, a woman who did not wait for miracles when she could build them herself. And she had also, on that same roof in that same rain, handed nails to a stranger who had turned out to be something much more than a stranger, because that was also who she was, a woman with enough practicality to see what was in front of her and enough courage to let it in. The children came in at the supper call, Clara first with her long-legged stride and her dark eyes and the commanding presence that she had apparently been born with, William behind her with his father's quiet watchfulness and a frog that he was trying to sneak past his mother in his coat pocket, and Margaret last, still considering something, her expression abstract with thought. "What are you thinking?" Clayton asked her as they came through the door, because Margaret's thoughts were always worth asking about. She focused on him with those large dark eyes. "I was thinking about the stars," she said. "About how far away they are and how the light takes time to get here, so maybe when we see them they are already different." Elvira and Clayton exchanged a look over the children's heads, the specific look of parents who have produced someone who is going to spend her life asking questions that the world is not entirely prepared for. "That's exactly right," Clayton said. "Where did you learn that?" "Miss Pryor said it," Margaret said. "I've been thinking about it for 3 days." "That's a good thing to think about," Elvira said. "Now sit down, supper is ready." They sat around the table that George Turner had made with his own hands in the first year of his marriage, still good and solid. And Elvira set the food out, and they ate together in the warm light of the lamp as the dark came in around the house, and the October stars began to show through the window. The ones that had been on their way from far away for longer than any of them could really hold in their minds. And if the light from those stars was old by the time it arrived, still it was light, and it landed on real things, on a roof that did not leak, on a barn that was warm, on a road that had once run past a fence line just at the right moment, on the faces of people who had found each other the way that good things are found, not through planning or perfection, but through the accumulated honesty of showing up, day after day, in the same place, choosing the same life with open hands. The fire in the hearth was the solid, steady kind that burns through the night, and the children talked and laughed and argued in the ordinary way of children who are secure enough to argue. And Clayton told William that the frog needed to go back to the creek before morning, which William accepted with negotiated reluctance. And Clara said she had decided to be a doctor when she grew up, which she had also announced twice before. And Elvira said that she saw no reason why not. And Margaret ate her supper and thought about stars. Later, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Elvira stood at the kitchen window looking at the yard, the barn, the pasture, the dark shapes of the live oaks against the sky. Clayton came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, and they stood there in the lamplight and the quiet, two people who had built something real in the real world. "I'm glad it rained that October," she said. "I'm glad you didn't wait for somebody else to fix it," he said. She turned to look at him. "I never wait," she said. "I know," he said. "That's one of the things I love best about you." Outside, the Texas night was wide and permanent, and full of stars that had been traveling toward them for longer than they could imagine. And the roof was solid, and the future was not a country of uncertainty anymore, but a specific, beloved, continuing place, full of people and work and argument and love and ordinary miraculous days. And it was enough. It was far more than enough. It was everything.